The coffee was getting cold, but Jake Morrison didn't seem to notice. He sat across from Kexthara in the small meeting room aboard Harmony Point, his hands wrapped around the ceramic mug like it might anchor him to something solid. The space station hummed quietly around them, a neutral zone where former enemies could meet without the weight of old wars pressing down on their shoulders. Kexthara studied the human carefully. 3 years had passed since the end of the human coalition. War, but Jake still carried himself like a soldier. His back stayed straight, his eyes moved constantly to check the exits, and his left hand bore the telltale scars of plasma burns. She had interviewed hundreds of warriors from dozens of species, but humans remained the most puzzling. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me, Captain Morrison," she said, her translator converting her words into smooth English. "I know this cannot be easy." Jake shifted in his chair. "Just Jake is fine. I'm not a captain anymore." His voice carried the flat tone that many veterans used when they wanted to keep their emotions locked away. "And to be honest, I'm not sure why I'm here." Kexthara had covered 12 different conflicts across the known galaxy. She had seen the methodical precision of Alterian shock troops, the berserker fury of Rigelian warriors, and the calculating coldness of her own people's military elite. But humans had been different. They fought with a desperate intensity that seemed to defy logic, throwing themselves into battles they should not have won. "Your species fascinates me," she admitted, pulling out her recording device. "During the war, human tactics often made no sense from a strategic standpoint. Yet you achieved victories that our best military minds still cannot explain." Jake's laugh held no humor. "Maybe we just got lucky." "Luck does not account for the Battle of Crimson Ridge. Your unit held off an entire Zephyrian division for 6 days with less than 100 soldiers. The odds were impossible." At the mention of Crimson Ridge, Jake's grip tightened on his coffee mug. Kexthara noticed how his breathing changed, becoming more shallow. She had touched something important. "The Coalition wants to understand how humans fight," she continued gently. "Not just your weapons or your ships, but what drives you. What makes a human soldier charge into plasma fire when any rational being would retreat?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her completely. "You want to know what drove us?" He looked up, meeting her large, dark eyes. "Fear." Kexthara blinked slowly, a sign of confusion in her species. "I do not understand." "Fear makes soldiers hesitate, makes them weak. Human warriors showed no fear during combat." "That's where you're wrong." Jake set down his mug and leaned forward. "We were terrified, every single one of us, every single day. The difference is what we did with that fear." This was not what Kexthara had expected to hear. In all her research, in all the footage she had studied, human soldiers appeared fearless. They charged enemy positions with wild battle cries. They held impossible defensive lines. They made sacrifices that seemed to come from beings who had no concept of their own mortality. But the recordings show humans displaying incredible courage. She protested. "Your soldiers would advance under fire that would break any other species." Jake rubbed his scarred hand across his face. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is being scared out of your mind and doing what needs to be done anyway." Kexthara activated her recording device. This conversation was taking a direction she had never anticipated, and she needed to capture every word. "Tell me about Crimson Ridge," she said. Jake was quiet again, staring at something she could not see. When he began to speak, his voice was soft, almost distant. Crimson Ridge was a mining colony on Kepler 442b. Strategically worthless, really. Just a few thousand miners and their families. But it sat right in the path of your people's advance toward the Centauri system. He paused, seeming to gather himself. "Command told us to hold it for 24 hours. just long enough for the civilians to evacuate and for the fleet to reposition. But you held it for 6 days. Yeah, we held it. Jake's smile was grim. 97 Marines against a full Zephyrian division. Your people had artillery, air support, and enough soldiers to overwhelm us 10 times over. We had some prefab bunkers and whatever ammunition we could carry. Kexthara leaned forward. This was the story she had come to hear, but not the way she had expected to hear it. The first night, I couldn't sleep, Jake continued. None of us could. We all knew the math. We all knew we were probably going to die on that ridge. Some of the younger Marines were crying. Others were writing letters home they knew would never get sent. Yet you fought. We fought because we were afraid. Jake's eyes met hers again, afraid of letting each other down, afraid of running while our friends stayed behind, afraid that our deaths wouldn't mean anything if we gave up too easily. Kexthara struggled to process this information. In Zephyrian military doctrine, fear was eliminated through extensive mental conditioning. Warriors entered battle in a state of calm, detachment, free from emotional interference. The idea that fear could be a weapon rather than a weakness was foreign to her. I need to ask you something, Jake said suddenly. If I tell you everything, if I explain exactly how humans fight and why, will you share it? Will you make sure other species understand? Of course. That is why I'm writing this book. Jake nodded slowly. Good, because the war is over, but there are still people out there who don't understand us. And misunderstanding leads to more wars. He stood up and walked to the small viewport that looked out onto the stars. Harmony Point rotated slowly, bringing different constellations into view. There's something else you need to know before we go any further, Jake said without turning around. What I'm about to tell you might change how your people see humans forever. Are you ready for that? Kexthara felt a strange sensation, something her species rarely experienced. It took her a moment to recognize it as anticipation mixed with unease. She was about to learn something that would reshape her understanding of the most dangerous species in the galaxy. I am ready, she said. Jake turned back to face her, and she saw something in his expression that made her pulse quicken. It was the look of someone about to reveal a secret that had been weighing on him for years. Then let me tell you about fear and what it really means to be human. Jake sat back down and picked up his coffee mug again. His hands were steady, but Kexthara noticed the small tremor in his left finger. Even now, years after the war, something about these memories affected him deeply. The second day on Crimson Ridge, your people started their real assault, Jake began. Not just probing attacks, but a full push with everything they had. I remember standing in my command bunker, watching the sensor readings as wave after wave of Zephyrian troops moved toward our position. Kexthara watched his face carefully. She had studied human expressions during her years as a war correspondent, learning to read the subtle signs of emotion that humans tried so hard to hide. How did you feel in that moment? She asked, terrified. Jake's answer came without hesitation. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. My mouth went dry. My hands started shaking. I wanted to run more than I had ever wanted. Anything in my life. This was not the story Kexthara expected. Every piece of coalition intelligence about human warriors described them as fearless, almost suicidal in their willingness to face overwhelming odds. But you stayed, she said. I stayed because I was more afraid of something else. Jake set down his mug and looked directly at her. I was more afraid of what would happen to my Marines if I ran. More afraid of living with the knowledge that I had abandoned them when they needed me most. Jake stood up and began pacing the small room. Kexthara recognized this behavior from other interviews with combat veterans. Sometimes moving helped them process difficult memories. There was this Marine in my unit, Lisa Parker, Sergeant Parker. She was from a small farming town back on Earth, had 2 kids waiting for her at home. Jake's voice became softer as he spoke about her. On the morning of the 2nd day, she came to me with tears in her eyes. She was afraid? She was terrified. She told me she had been awake all night thinking about her children, wondering if she would ever see them again. She asked me if I thought we were going to die on that ridge. Kexthara leaned forward. This was completely different from everything. She thought she knew about human soldiers. What did you tell her? I told her the truth. I said we probably were going to die. Jake stopped pacing and faced the viewport again. But I also told her that we were going to make it count. That we were going to hold that ridge long enough for those miners and their families to get away. Safely. And that was enough? Jake was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight that Kexthara had never heard before. 2 hours later, a Zephyrian plasma grenade landed in the middle of her squad. Without thinking, without hesitation, Lisa threw herself on top of it. Jake turned back to face Kexthara. She saved 6 Marines with that action. 6 people who made it home to their own families because she was brave enough to be afraid. Kexthara felt her breathing change. In Zephyrian culture, such an action would be seen as the result of perfect mental conditioning, a warrior achieving a state of pure duty without emotional interference. But Jake was describing something entirely different. She was afraid when she did it? She was sobbing. Jake's words hit Kexthara like a physical blow. I saw the footage later from another Marine's helmet camera. Lisa was crying when she jumped on that grenade. She knew exactly what she was doing, knew exactly what it would cost her, and she was absolutely terrified. Then why did she do it? Because she was more afraid of watching her friends die than she was of dying herself. Jake returned to his chair, but he remained on the edge of the seat, as if ready to move again at any moment. That's the thing about humans that your people never understood. Our fear doesn't make us weak. It makes us dangerous. Kexthara struggled to process this information. Everything she had learned about combat psychology suggested that fear was an obstacle to overcome, not a tool to be used. There was another Marine, Ben Williams. Corporal Williams. Jake continued his story, his voice taking on a rhythm that suggested he had told these tales before, perhaps to therapists or other veterans. He was barely 20 years old, fresh out of training. Kid from the city who had never even held a gun before he enlisted. What happened to him? On the 4th day, we identified a Zephyrian strong point that was giving us serious trouble. Heavy plasma cannon dug in deep, perfect fields of fire. It was tearing apart any Marine who tried to move across the central plateau. Jake paused to take a sip of his cold coffee, making a face at the taste, but drinking it anyway. Someone had to take out that position, or we were all dead. I was trying to figure out which squad to send when Ben volunteered. Jake shook his head slowly. This scared kid who jumped at every explosion, who had been writing letters to his mother every night, volunteered to assault a heavily defended position by himself. Was he no longer afraid? He was more afraid than ever. Jake's laugh was bitter. I could hear him over the cum system as he moved toward that position. He was crying, talking to himself, apologizing to his mother for what he was about to do. Kexthara found herself holding her breath, but he kept moving forward, step by step, terrified out of his mind, but moving forward anyway. He crawled through plasma fire that should have killed him 10 times over. When he finally reached that bunker, he was sobbing so hard he could barely speak. Did he succeed? He took out the entire position with demolition charges. Saved probably 30 Marines with that action. Jake met her eyes again, and the whole time he was scared enough that any other species would have been paralyzed with fear. Kexthara realized she was beginning to understand something fundamental about human nature that had escaped every coalition analyst, your people. Fight not despite being afraid, but because you are afraid. Now you're getting it. Jake nodded approvingly. Fear tells us what matters. It tells us what we can't afford to lose. And when humans are afraid of losing something important to them, they become capable of things that look impossible to outside observers. But how do you function in combat while experiencing such intense fear? Jake smiled for the first time. Since the interview began, it was not a happy smile. That's the real secret. We don't just function despite the fear. We use it. We channel it. We turn it into fuel for doing things that scare us even more than dying. I do not understand. Then let me tell you about the final assault, Jake said, settling back in his chair. Let me tell you about what happens when a group of terrified humans decides that their fear of failing is stronger than their fear of death. Jake rubbed his temples with both hands, as if trying to ease a headache that had been building for 3 years. Kexthara waited patiently. She had learned that rushing human veterans never worked. They needed time to find the right words for memories that often defied description. The final assault came on day 6, Jake said finally. Your commanders had figured out that we weren't going to break the way they expected, so they decided to end it with overwhelming force. He stood up again and walked to the viewport. Outside, a cargo ship was docking with the station, its lights blinking in the standard approach pattern. By that point, we had maybe 40 Marines left out of the original 97. We were running low on ammunition, medical supplies, everything. The bunkers were falling apart from constant bombardment. Jake's reflection in the viewport looked older than his actual years. Any military strategist would have told you we should surrender. But you did not. We couldn't. Jake turned back to face her. Not because we were brave, but because we were too afraid to quit. Kexthara tilted her head, trying to understand. Afraid of what? Afraid that all the people who had already died would have died for nothing. Afraid that those mining families might not have made it to safety yet. Afraid that if we gave up, we would spend the rest of our lives knowing we could have done more. Jake returned to his chair, but this time he leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The Zephyrian final assault was supposed to be simple. 3 full battalions supported by artillery and airstrikes. They would hit us from 3 directions at once, overwhelm our remaining defenses, and end the battle in under an hour. That should have been more than sufficient. It should have been. Jake's voice became distant again. But they made one mistake. They underestimated what scared humans are willing to do. Kexthara activated her recording device again, making sure she captured every word of what came next. I had this Marine, Danny Collins, Private Collins. He was 19 years old, from some small town in the middle of nowhere. Kid who used to fix farm equipment before the war. Jake's hands clenched into fists. Danny was terrified of enclosed spaces. Hated being underground, hated tight spaces. Always had to sleep near an exit. What role did he play in the final battle? Everything changed when your people breached the main bunker complex. They used shaped charges to blow open the central airlock, and suddenly we had atmosphere venting into space. Jake's breathing became more rapid as he relived the memory. The blast doors were damaged, wouldn't seal properly. If we lost atmosphere, everyone in that section would die. Kexthara could see where this story was leading, but she needed to hear it all. Someone had to hold that airlock manually, while the tech team tried to get the blast doors working again. It was a job for someone small enough to fit in the damaged opening, strong enough to hold against the pressure differential. Jake met her eyes. It was also a death sentence. And Danny volunteered? Danny was throwing up from fear when I explained what needed to be done. This kid who was afraid of small spaces, and I was asking him to climb into a damaged airlock while atmosphere screamed past him into vacuum. Jake's voice cracked slightly. He looked at me with tears streaming down his face and said he would. Do it. The room fell silent, except for the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Kexthara found herself dreading what came next. Danny crawled into that airlock opening and braced himself against the damaged door. The pressure trying to suck him out into space was enormous, but he held on. Jake's hands were shaking now. I could hear him over the comm system, crying, and praying and begging for someone to get the blast doors working. How long did he hold it? 18 minutes. Jake's answer was barely above a whisper. 18 minutes of fighting against explosive decompression, while his friends worked frantically to repair the blast door system. Kexthara felt something cold settling in her stomach. Did they succeed? They got the doors working. The airlock sealed. 23 Marines lived because Danny held that breach. Jake wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. But when we pulled him out, his heart had stopped. The medic said it was cardiac arrest, brought on by extreme stress and terror. The silence stretched between them. Kexthara had covered wars across the galaxy, but she had never heard of anything quite like this. He died of fear? He died because he was more afraid of letting his friends die than he was of dying himself. Jake's voice was steady again, but his eyes remained bright with unshed tears. When we found him, he was still gripping the airlock door. His hands were frozen in place from the pressure and cold, but he never let go. Kexthara began to understand, something that coalition strategists had missed completely. They had prepared for human recklessness, for berserker charges and suicidal tactics. They had not prepared for warriors who could function at peak effectiveness while experiencing levels of fear that would incapacitate any other species. Your people kept trying to break our morale, Jake continued. But they didn't understand that our morale wasn't based on confidence or fearlessness. It was based on being more afraid of failure than we were of death. This is why human units were so difficult to defeat. Exactly. Jake nodded. Your commanders kept expecting us to break when the casualties mounted, when the situation became hopeless. But the worse things got, the more afraid we became of letting each other down. And the more afraid we became, the more dangerous we got. Jake pulled out a small device from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. Kexthara recognized it as a human data storage unit. I brought you something, he said. Helmet camera footage from the final assault. Audio and video from inside our helmets during the worst of the fighting. Kexthara stared at the device. She had requested such footage in her original interview. Proposal, but no human veteran had ever been willing to share it. Are you certain you want me to see this? I need you to see it. Jake's expression was serious. Because the footage shows something that might change how your people understand humans forever. What does it show? It shows what we really sounded like during combat. Not the war cries and battle shouts that made it into your intelligence reports. The real sounds. The breathing, the sobbing, the whispered prayers. Jake tapped the device with one finger. It shows that every act of heroism you witnessed came from soldiers who were absolutely terrified. Kexthara picked up the device with trembling hands. She realized she was about to hear something that would fundamentally alter her understanding of the most feared warriors in the galaxy. There's one more thing you need to know before you listen to those recordings, Jake said quietly. What is that? Every human soldier you hear on those recordings volunteered for their final mission. Every single one, even though they knew it would probably kill them. Jake stood up and walked toward the door. Listen to the recordings and ask yourself this question. What kind of species becomes more dangerous the more afraid they get? Kexthara sat alone in her quarters aboard Harmony Point, staring at the data device Jake had given her. 3 hours had passed since their interview ended, but she had not yet worked up the courage to listen to the recordings. Something told her that once she heard those sounds, her understanding of the universe would change forever. She picked up the device and connected it to her personal terminal. The screen lit up with a menu of files, each labeled with dates and locations from the Battle of Crimson Ridge. Her hand hovered over the first entry for a long moment before she finally selected it. The audio began with the sound of breathing. Heavy, rapid breathing that spoke of barely controlled panic. Then came a voice she recognized as Jake's, but younger, shakier than the man she had just interviewed. "This is Captain Morrison. Day 6, hour 0430. Final assault is beginning. All units, remember your training. Remember why we're here." But underneath Jake's official words, Kexthara could hear something else. The tremor in his voice, the way his breathing caught between words. This was not the voice of a fearless commander, but of a terrified young man trying desperately to hold himself together. More voices joined the recording as other Marines checked in. Each one carried the same undertone of barely controlled fear. Kexthara listened as Sergeant Parker reported her squad's readiness while her voice shook with emotion. She heard Corporal Williams whisper a prayer to a god she did not recognize, his words broken by quiet sobs. Then the real fighting began. The sounds that filled her quarters were unlike anything in her extensive collection of combat recordings. Where other species fought with grim determination or cold efficiency, these humans fought with raw desperation. She could hear their ragged breathing, their muttered curses, their whispered apologies to people who were not there. "Danny, we need someone for the airlock." Jake's voice came through the speakers, tight with stress. "I'll do it, sir." The response came from a young voice that wavered with terror. "I'm scared, but I'll do it." "I know you're scared, Danny. We all are. That's what makes us human." Kexthara paused the recording and sat back in her chair. In all her years covering conflicts, she had never heard soldiers admit their fears so openly during combat. Most species either eliminated fear through training or hid it completely. But these humans seemed to acknowledge their terror as naturally as they acknowledged their need for oxygen. She resumed the recording and listened to Danny Collins' final 18 minutes. His voice carried clearly over the communication system as he wedged himself into the damaged airlock. She heard his breathing become more labored as the pressure differential fought against him. She heard him crying, praying, calling out encouragement to his teammates, even as his own situation became desperate. "Keep working on those blast doors," Danny's voice said, high and tight with fear. "I can hold this. I can hold this." But Kexthara could hear that he was dying. The stress in his voice, the way his words began to slur, the moments when his breathing stopped altogether before resuming in gasps. This young human was killing himself with terror, and he knew it, but he refused to let go. When the blast doors finally sealed and Danny's voice went silent, Kexthara found herself weeping. It was an unusual response for her species, but she could not stop the tears from flowing. She listened to more recordings throughout the night. Each one revealed the same pattern. Humans who were absolutely terrified, who spoke openly about their fear, but who used that fear to drive themselves to impossible acts of courage. They did not fight despite being afraid. They fought because they were afraid. The next morning, Kexthara began writing. Her book would be different from anything she had planned. Instead of analyzing human tactics or technology, she would reveal the psychological foundation that made humans the most unpredictable warriors in the galaxy. She wrote about fear as a weapon, about how humans transformed their terror into tactical advantage. She explained how other species had misunderstood human courage, mistaking fear-driven desperation for fearless aggression. Most importantly, she revealed the recordings Jake had given her, letting readers hear for themselves what human warriors really sounded like during combat. The book's publication sent shockwaves across Coalition space. Military academies that had spent years trying to eliminate fear from their soldiers suddenly found themselves studying how to harness it instead. Psychologists who had dismissed human emotion as a weakness began researching how terror could enhance rather than impair combat effectiveness. 6 months after the book's release, Kekstara received a message from Jake. He was working as a civilian contractor now, helping to design new training programs for coalition forces. His message was brief but warm. "Thank you for keeping your promise," he wrote. The truth needed to be told. Attached to his message was a video file. Kekstara opened it and found herself watching a coalition training exercise. But instead of the usual emotionless drills she expected, she saw something remarkable. Young Zephyrian cadets were being taught to acknowledge their fears, to channel their anxiety into focused action. The instructors, many of them human veterans like Jake, were explaining how fear could sharpen reflexes and strengthen resolve. One cadet raised his hand during the lesson. "Instructor Morrison, how do we know when fear is helping us instead of hurting us?" Jake's answer came clearly through the recording. "When your fear of failing your teammates becomes stronger than your fear of dying, that's when you know you're thinking like a human." Kekstara watched the video several times, fascinated by what she was seeing. The coalition military was not just studying human tactics anymore. They were learning to think like humans, to embrace the emotional complexity that other species had always tried to eliminate. Her book became required reading at military academies throughout coalition space. More importantly, it began changing how different species understood each other. The revelation that humans used fear as a strength rather than a weakness opened discussions about what other emotions might be tactical advantages rather than liabilities. A year later, Kekstara published a follow-up study examining how human emotional responses translated to civilian life. She discovered that the same fear-driven determination that made humans formidable in combat also made them exceptional at building, creating, and protecting the things they cared about. Their terror of losing what mattered to them drove them to innovations and sacrifices that benefited entire civilizations. The final chapter of her memoir posed a question that continued to fascinate coalition scholars. If fear made humans so effective in war, what made them even more valuable in peace? Her answer was simple but profound. Humans feared meaninglessness more than they feared death, which meant they would fight just as hard to build something worthwhile as they would to destroy something threatening. As Kekstara finished writing her final chapter, she realized that Jake had been right about one thing. Understanding humans had indeed changed how she saw the universe, but it had also made her optimistic about the future. Any species capable of transforming their deepest fears into their greatest strengths was a species worth knowing, worth fighting alongside, and worth calling friends. She sent a final message to Jake before submitting her manuscript. "Thank you for teaching me that courage and fear are not opposites. They are partners." His reply came within hours. "Welcome to being human."